Hello everyone, I'm Neil Paterson and welcome to the Sky News Daily. Today, let's talk about Suella Braverman because guess what? She's in trouble once again. I jest, of course, because the more eagle-eyed of you will have noticed that the Home Secretary is never too far away from a headline on the front pages. You might remember her thwarted leadership ambition. She got to the second round of the Conservative leadership contest and then decided to help out Rishi Sunak. You'll be very well aware of her plans to send people to Rwanda and, of course, her strategy to stop the boats. But now, she finds herself in hot water over a speeding fine.
Did you ask civil servants to put you on a one-on-one speeding course?
In relation to the process, I'm focused on delivering for the British people, do my job as Home Secretary. What I will say is that, in my view, I'm confident that nothing untoward has happened.
Now, what we know, and facts are still emerging, is that way back in 2022, when she was the Attorney General, she was caught speeding. As often is the case, she was offered the chance to avoid 3 points on her licence by participating in one of those speed awareness courses. But the story has then developed a couple of complications. First, that she asked her civil servants to intervene in the matter. Second, that her advisor may well have misled reporters who were chasing the very story. Little surprise then that journalists are now in something of a high-speed pursuit of the truth. And guess what? We're taking you along for the ride. OK, but let us start with the facts as we understand them. Our political correspondent, Rob Powell, well, he has just hightailed it back from Downing Street. Rob, I mean, first things first, what exactly has Suella Braverman been accused of?
I think there's a couple of key issues to this, Neil. I think the first is basically the sort of bad optics for politicians of asking for something that isn't generally available to the wider public. In this case, it's that Suella Braverman was caught speeding last summer. And like anyone, she was given the option of either taking the points on her licence or doing a speed awareness course. Initially, she chose to do the speed awareness course. Then when she became Home Secretary, she attempted to get civil servants and then a political advisor to see if they could arrange a private one-to-one speed awareness course instead of going to a group session. When that was knocked back and rebutted by the speed awareness people, she then decided just to take the points. So I think the first thing is that she is essentially asking for something that looks like she didn't want to be publicly identified as the Home Secretary who'd been speeding and caught out. The second thing, which I think is maybe the more substantive issue around the ministerial code, where she could get into more bother if there's to be an inquiry, is that she initially asked civil servants to help her with this. Now, civil servants are the politically impartial bits of government, and to ask them to sort of be getting involved in your personal affairs potentially contravenes part of the ministerial code around maintaining civil service impartiality. So I think those are the two things for Suella Braverman that she's having to battle with at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Dave Penman from the FDA union, that union that represents many, many civil servants, said this: they don't do their shopping, they don't look after their children, and they don't sort out their parking fines. I mean, there has to be a barrier, a delineation between the work that is expected of civil servants, be they political appointees like special advisors or career civil service, and the minister that they're working for.
Yeah, well, what Suella Braverman's team say is this wasn't so much sort of using the civil service as sort of extended housekeeping. This was more her checking over what she should be doing, because she initially got this speed awareness course and this fine, this penalty, when she was Attorney General. Then she was appointed Home Secretary, which comes with a big step up in terms of the security protection and the security regime that you have to have along with that post. They maintained that this was about her checking what would happen now if she had to go to a speed awareness course, who she would have to take with her. The other thing to say is, on Sunday, we spoke to one high-profile lawyer nicknamed Mr. Loophole, famed for getting people off road traffic penalties and incidents and things like that. And he said, look, there's nothing unusual about high-profile people doing one-to-ones. And actually, often the speed awareness people quite like it, because all of the other people sat in there being told off for speeding don't get distracted by the fact that the Home Secretary sat in the corner with three blokes with, guns shoved down their trousers. So on that, I mean, I'm not necessarily sure that either of these things are a sort of mortal, fatal blow to Suella Braverman. And I think even if she's found to have broken the ministerial code over involving civil servants, that's not necessarily at the most egregious end of breaches that you can go through on. I think the difficulty for her, though, is this is something else to add into the kind of crowded, fraught political landscape that she's trying to navigate at the moment. It is more noise and more fuss that Rishi Sunak's Home Secretary is causing, and it's whether he feels or whether she feels that they want to carry on in this position, in this situation where more things seem to be added on top of the various challenges she's having to deal with.
In terms of her candour on this topic, we have the Daily Mirror suggesting that when her special advisor was directly asked, has she been caught speeding, the answer came back no. Bold-faced lie.
So this is another part of this story which could eventually land her in a bit of trouble as well. As you say, this was 6 weeks or so ago. A Mirror reporter went to her team and asked them about whether she'd been on a speed awareness course. They said no. Now, interestingly, last night when the Mirror published this story, the special advisor in question I messaged and asked whether that story in the Mirror was true, whether they'd essentially lied to a newspaper about it. And I got a reply back saying it's not true, that I was asked about driver awareness courses and I denied that. That is true. And that is accurate because she didn't go on the speed awareness course, she took the penalty. But then on this question of whether she had had a speeding penalty, the explanation I got back from this official in question on that was that they couldn't recall and had no recollection of that part of the conversation. Now, of course, the Mirror then subsequently published the entire transcript of it, which made clear that this person was asked about this. When I went back to the advisor in question about that, they essentially said that it was a long conversation and they couldn't recall the details of it. But that does pose difficulties, firstly because it suggests that a member of her advisory team have been misleading journalists. Secondly, though, the more interesting question, which I haven't been able to get to the bottom of with the official in question, is whether at the time he was telling the truth, whether he knew at the time whether this speeding penalty had happened, and essentially whether the Home Secretary had held back that information. And I think if there is mileage and potential for that Home Secretary could get in even hotter water if it essentially emerges that she'd been misleading people about the existence of the speeding fine and speeding penalty in the first place.
Curiouser and curiouser. But look, absent a screeching handbrake turn in tone from the Home Secretary, the key question is whether what happened amounts to a breach of what's known as the Ministerial Code, and if so, what punishment is then justified. Let's bring in Tim Durant from the Institute for Government. Tim, a couple of definitions to start us off. Exactly what is the Ministerial Code and what is it supposed to achieve?
So the Ministerial Code is a document that each Prime Minister issues when they first come into office, setting out what they expect of their ministers, what ministers are able to do, how they can use government resources, what they're expected to declare in terms of their personal interests, and basically how they behave in government. It doesn't have a legal status. Its kind of status and its power comes from the fact that the Prime Minister says, this is what I expect of my ministers, and I will make sure that you are held to account in this way of behaving.
So on the face of it, with the level of knowledge that we all possess about what seems to have been going on with Suella Braverman and points and driving courses and the rest of it, does it appear to you that the code has been breached?
I'm not going to give you a straight answer, I'm afraid. I think
I thought you might not.
I think what it depends on is exactly what she asked of her civil servants. So if she asked, this has happened, I've been caught speeding, are you able to help me work out a way to get a private speeding awareness course? That's one thing, right? They can say, no, Minister, we're not allowed to do that because that's a personal issue and we can't help you with that. And that's totally fine. She's able to ask for guidance and say, can you explain to me exactly the level of support that you as civil servants can provide for me? That's okay. If she says, I want you to find this and I want you to make this special arrangement for me, that is, I think, more problematic because that suggests that she either didn't understand or wasn't taking into account the fact that the civil service aren't supposed to provide that kind of support for ministers. But at the end of the day, the civil service quite rightly said, I'm sorry to Home Secretary, we cannot do that for you. We work for the government. We are not able to support you in this personal issue that you're dealing with. So actually, I think it depends very much on the kind of the tenor of the request that was made. I think another question that needs looking into is what exactly she told her special advisors to say. And I think that's potentially more interesting, right? So
why more problematic?
Because she is the kind of boss of that special advisor, she's the manager, and there is a requirement on special advisors to be honest, and there is a requirement on ministers to be honest. And if there is a kind of explicit attempt to kind of hide this information, that I think does raise questions about whether or not potentially the special advisor code or the ministerial code was breached. But with all of these potential breaches, what is ultimately going to come down to is the Prime Minister's judgment.
Just on that topic, because as you've already mentioned, the ministerial code is not a legally binding document. Same, I presume, would be the case for the SPAD code as well.
Yep.
So everything ultimately then, is, as you say, comes down to the judgment of one individual, the Prime Minister, presumably with some input from his ethics advisor.
Absolutely. So Laurie Magnus is the PM's advisor on ministerial interests. And if the PM asks him to undertake an investigation, he can talk to the Home Secretary, he can talk to her team and say, okay, what was the nature of the conversations that were had? Can you explain who asked what and what happened? He would then write that up into a report, which he delivered to Rishi Sunak. But it is Rishi Sunak's decision.
Yeah, you're sorry to interrupt. Let's just be absolutely clear here. This investigation does not start. So Laurie does not begin any form of work unless Rishi Sunak goes, well, I'd like you to look into this. It is his decision. The decision is entirely and solely within his purview.
Absolutely. So Laurie could say, Prime Minister, I think I should look into this. And the expectation, I think, would be that the Prime Minister would say yes. But as you say, it's his decision. He could say no.
We have had Prime Ministers ignore their ethics advisor, haven't we?
Absolutely. Boris Johnson ignored the findings of one of his advisors who then resigned. So the investigation may or may not even happen. But if it does happen, at the end of it, Sir Laurie Magnus will write this report and deliver it to the Prime Minister. And again, it is the Prime Minister's decision. Okay, based on what you have told me, I think this is or is not a breach of the ministerial code. And if it is, then this is the kind of sanction or sort of outcome that I want in this case. So it all comes down to the PM and kind of his relationship with the Home Secretary, the kind of political considerations that he will be making. Okay, there is no kind of if X, then Y as written into the code.
I suspect I'm about to ask another question to which you won't be desperate to provide an immediate and fulsome answer, but I'm going to try anyway. I mean, what is the point of having an independent ethics advisor if that independent ethics advisor cannot act independently, that they cannot start an investigation without the literal written sign-off of the Prime Minister? I mean, do we have a functional system of ethics within government?
I mean, it's a question that we at the Institute have asked as well. You know, we've argued that Sir Laurie and that the person in that role should have the ability to start their own investigations without the permission of the Prime Minister, because, as you say, that's the only way that they are fully independent. So at the moment, Sir Laurie is clearly sort of independently minded, and the Prime Minister, when there have been allegations in the past about ministerial misbehaviour, the Prime Minister has always said, OK, I would like an investigation. So at the moment, I think you can argue that the system as it is constructed is working well. The problem with the current system and this kind of informality of it and the fact that it all relies on the Prime Minister is if there is a Prime Minister who is less fussed about integrity and ethical behaviour in government, either they can not request an investigation be started or they could not appoint a ministerial advisor in the first place. So Liz Truss, she was only Prime Minister for a few weeks, but she didn't appoint a ministerial advisor during her premiership. And so I think this speaks to the point that, you know, if a Prime Minister decides that this issue is not important to them or is willing to just kind of ride out the criticism, there's no way of kind of enforcing those ethical standards in government if the PM isn't involved. So I think, yeah, you know, down the line, a stronger role for the independent advisor where they are able to start their own investigations without requiring the PM's permission and indeed publish the findings of those investigations. Because as well, we won't find out what Sir Laurie has said to the Prime Minister until Downing Street decides that it can be made public.
See, here's the thing, Tim. I'm old enough and ugly enough to remember a time when, you know, we never even got this far into the process, that cabinet ministers who'd been caught with their trousers down would just resign. They would hand the letter into number 10, leave cabinet, spend a year in the wilderness and then come back to another cabinet job, you know, 12 to 18 months later. I mean, have you ever known a political period like this? Dominic Raab investigation, the Suella Braverman thing that's going on, Partygate and so on, ministers hanging around in positions that they were clearly not suited for and frankly in a previous age would have resigned from the post in disgrace.
I think, as you say, there's been a sort of a snowball of these kind of stories over the last few years. I think the specific issue here with Suella Braverman's speeding ticket, I think actually if that were just happening in isolation, maybe this wouldn't be such a big, you know, discussion. But it's because of that context. It's because of Suella Braverman resigned from Liz Truss's government because she was found to have broken the ministerial code last year and then was reappointed by Rishi Sunak a week later. She's also the Home Secretary and she was Attorney General when the speeding happened. So these are two roles that are all about kind of law and order and upholding the law. And so, that kind of raises questions about, okay, well, do we expect particularly high standards of people in those roles compared to anyone in public life? So I think you need to look at both the issue of what's been alleged, and again, we don't know the full details yet. There hasn't been a full investigation, but it's also bearing in mind that wider context, which I think perhaps has changed our expectations and meant that people kind of reach for the ministerial code or reach for a kind of ethical allegation in a way that perhaps if this was happening in 2018, people would have, asked a couple of questions, but we would have moved on.
Now, I know this because I've done it myself. Whenever a cabinet minister ends up on the front pages, we journalists have a favourite game, standing in Downing Street outside number 10, shouting at them.
Any regrets, Home Secretary? Are you subject to different laws than the rest of us, Home Secretary? Is it time to go?
But I have to admit, I am far more interested in a more official response from the government. Let's bring Rob Powell, our political correspondent, back in. Rob, what have we been hearing from the government?
Yeah, so where we are right now is that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, spoke to his ethics advisor this morning, consulted with him.
Sir Laurie Magnus, yeah.
Yeah, so this is on Rishi Sunak, whether he wants to get Sir Laurie Magnus to investigate. At the moment, at 10 to 2 in the afternoon, we don't have that information. Number 10 aren't able to confirm that yet. But clearly that comes with a big political judgment in that if he does decide to take some sort of action against Suella Braverman, he risks a degree of tension or a bit of a spat, if you like, with some of her supporters on the sort of more pro-Brexit right-wing side of the party. Yeah,
I mean, look, this is certainly not happening at a politically opportune moment for either the Prime Minister or indeed the Home Secretary. A little later this week, we've got those immigration figures coming out, and frankly, we're all sitting here expecting it to be an eye-watering number.
Yeah, and I think this is all massively relevant to what is going on with the Home Secretary at the moment. There's the migration statistics, as you say, which are expected later this week that will show levels, we think, going to another record high. Now, when you're a Home Secretary like Suella Braverman, who styles themselves as a bit of a hardliner on this is not something that you want to wear. The other part that's been going on below the waterline is something of a push and pull within government, within cabinet, on how to get those numbers down. So Suella Braverman has a degree of government-level tension going on. There is also a degree of party-level tension around her as well, which I think really started to grow from a speech she gave a week ago at the National Conservatism Conference, a right-wing conference not tied to government. And I was sat in that speech listening to it, and quite frankly, it sounded more like a speech that someone in a Tory leadership campaign would give rather than a sitting government minister. There was sort of a lot about her backstory and her family history, what she sees conservatism as. There were sort of calls for the UK to train more of their own fruit pickers and butchers. There wasn't a lot on government policy. It almost sounded like this was someone campaigning from the outside to influence immigration policy rather than the person that basically has their finger on the button and has the control over it in the first place. Now, as the week's gone on, I'm told that has rubbed various Tory MPs up the wrong way. So whilst it appeals to one section, others frankly felt she went too far. She overstepped where the government line was, and she did something that sounded too much like a leadership pitch. And I think when you take that sort of government-led tension and the party-led tension together, it breeds this sort of swamp whereby leaks and embarrassing stories like the speeding fine more easily pop out.
But when Suella Braverman is addressing that right-wing national conservatism conference, the NatCs, as I saw some wags describing it on social media over the past few days, I mean, she is in essence speaking to her base within the party, isn't she? So I am just wondering, if someone is leaking this stuff, do they really want her on the backbenches? Because presumably that is where she is most dangerous. If she's in cabinet, then at least the Prime Minister has a leash on her.
Yeah, I mean, there's various theories about how the story over the weekend made it into the public domain, none of which I know to be true. I don't know which one is correct, but I can share the various theories if you like. The one is that it was a sanctioned warning shot from government to try and basically put her back in her box after that speech last Monday. The difficulty clearly with that is you don't want to necessarily end up in a position where you're riling up the right of the party and causing the Prime Minister more damage. I think maybe the most likely explanation for it is it's someone that could think they're doing Number 10 a favour. So whilst it's not sanctioned by government, it's someone who is an ally of the Prime Minister who thinks they're doing a favour to Number 10 by essentially trying to kind of clip the wings of someone who has been causing problems. But as you say, it presents an opportunity, essentially, that if Suella Braverman feels like she doesn't want to wear the migration data, she doesn't want to wear being a Home Secretary essentially overseeing a very liberal immigration policy at the moment, something that could curtail future leadership hopes if she hopes to sort of get into Number 10 on the back of the right of the party. This gives her a way out, which is why if it is someone doing it to try and benefit Rishi Sunak, it actually could end up wounding him. Of course, you try to read into where stories come from, and the reality of it is sometimes it's a bit of everything, and it's someone that maybe gets a little bit carried away in a bar or chatting with a journalist. So it may not be a sort of set conspiracy like this, but I think the fact that there are various explanations that pop up around it show that at the moment Suella Braverman is playing various levels of political games with various other opponents and people within her party, and I think it won't necessarily work out well for her, and it may not work out well for the Prime Minister either.
My thanks to Rob Powell, Tim Durant, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.